Hello, and welcome to Climate Fix Podcast. Here we dive into evidence-based solutions to climate change and various other pressing environmental issues. This podcast is created by Americans for Nuclear Energy, a pro-nuclear environmental organization. We take no money from industry or special interest groups. All donations are from individuals like you, interested in a grassroots scientific movement to solve the world's most pressing scientific problem, global climate change. We hope you approach these ideas with humanism and an open mind. Our mission statement is as follows. Nuclear energy is safe, cheap, plentiful, clean, and efficient. It has the capability to stop and reverse climate change while addressing the ever-growing demand for electricity globally. We strive to educate American citizens about this technology and to dispel misconceptions with facts. We firmly believe that both human civilization and industrialism can easily coexist with a healthy environment. Join us in helping to plan a prescription for a feverish planet, or as we like to say, a climate fix.
This is your host, Phil Ord.
And this is your co-host, Colby Kirk.
This episode is entitled Legalizing Nuclear Power. We are thrilled to be able to talk to energy sustainability expert, Dr. Ben Herd, who is one of the leading pro-nuclear voices in Australia. The country is one of the dirtiest grids in the developed world and also has a ban on the use of nuclear power. We discussed their nuclear power ban and how it came into existence. Ben is vocally opposed to the ban and finds it absolutely absurd for climate reasons. Through his activism and his organization Bright New World, he is looking to bring about political change surrounding acceptance of the technology. Nuclear power is not banned in the United States, but its industry is in dire straits, with many imminent nuclear power plant closures. It is regulated to death and is still politically charged with lots of negative perceptions. For all intents and purposes, it might as well be illegal in America. Ben and his work can offer us insight into our strategy to get nuclear back on track here in the States. We talk about political strategy to attain support for clean fission energy, what Australia should do, and advice for nuclear advocacy in America in order to make it cool again. We also dive into details of Australia's dirty energy problems and its status as the world's largest exporter of coal. Additionally, we talk about the limits of wind and solar to decarbonize the Australian continent.
Here's a bit of background on Ben. Dr. Ben Herd is recognized as a leading voice for the use of nuclear technologies to address our most pressing global challenges. It certainly didn't start that way, though. Previously in his career, he was a member of various environmental NGOs and shared their basic objection to nuclear technologies. After completing a master's in sustainability, he started working on major projects concerning climate change. However, he started to fear that there was just no solution available to match the scale of the problems at hand. Instead of continuing his objection to nuclear technology, he kept quiet about it for a few years and did some learning. That was the start of his journey of writing, presenting, advocating, and learning more about how we can reinvent the future using all of our knowledge and ingenuity. Ben announced his changed position on nuclear technologies in 2010 and has since traveled the world as an invited speaker to share that experience and speak to audiences both within and outside the nuclear industry to consider how we can best tackle climate change and its interrelated challenges, including changing our approach to nuclear technologies. He founded Bright New World in 2016 to provide a new organization for people who want pragmatic, compassionate, and science-based environmentalism, in particular, that which values the role of nuclear technologies. Ben received his PhD from the University of Adelaide in 2018, where he examined clean energy supply. During this time, he published the highly cited paper, Burden of Proof, a comprehensive review of the feasibility of 100% renewable electricity systems. He has presented his research findings at conferences in Australia and around the world. Later in 2018, Ben Herd was featured on 60 Minutes Australia. In an episode about nuclear power, he and the show's host received unprecedented access to the damaged Fukushima reactors in order to really convey the actual extent of the accident and explain the incredible overall safety of the technology. On air, he also described nuclear's potential to solve climate change and the energy dilemma that so many countries are facing. Ben currently works in the private sector on energy and asset performance projects and is a board member of Bright New World.
It's amazing that Ben had such a transformation to become pro-nuclear after he took time to educate himself about it. He's quite accomplished. I'm excited to talk to Ben today because he is on the front lines in Australia, advocating for nuclear against an effective legal ban on the technology. For a continent that provides a third of the world's uranium supplies, Australia has no nuclear power plants. Despite many green groups vocally pushing for renewables in response to climate change, the Australian grid remains dominated by fossil fuels. Nuclear power can be the optimal source of power to utilize Australia's resources and to decarbonize their electric supply.
And I'm happy to finally be talking to Ben, as I've been reading and citing a lot of his work. The Australian grid is fascinating for many reasons. It is roughly the size of the continental United States, yet has about a tenth of the population. It also has a very strong renewables-only ideology, which is dominating the energy debate. Burden of Proof was one of my favorite pieces authored by Ben, which goes over 4 basic requirements every energy policy roadmap should have, but are often lacking from 100% renewable roadmaps. Out of the 24 renewable-only roadmaps that were referenced in his study, none of them satisfied all 4 requirements.
And Bright New World sounds like the most important climate organization in Australia could really learn from right now. Even though the US and Australia are 2 very different countries, the nuclear movement in America can learn lots of strategies from organizations like them to advance social and political acceptance of the technology.
I totally agree. Well, let's get to it. Here's our discussion with Dr. Ben Hurd.
Thank you so much for coming on, Ben.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Phil. It's good to finally make your acquaintance after a lot of years on the internet.
Yep, we're on Twitter a lot, so it's good to finally interact with you voice to voice. So.
Absolutely. Yep, it's terrific. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Ben, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization, Bright New World?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I've been involved in talking about nuclear power for actually 10 years to the day very soon. So about 10 years ago, after a few years of thinking very hard about the topic, I spoke up at an event that I planned in my home city of Adelaide to say that I had changed my mind about nuclear power. And that was coming from the perspective of someone who'd been through a master's in sustainability, had joined a climate change related team at an engineering consultancy, and so cared very, very deeply about that issue of climate change. But had sort of got myself to a position of serious concern that we weren't equipped to deal with that on the basis of the solutions that we were letting ourselves take seriously. So on March the 8th in 2011, I spoke at an event in Adelaide attended by about 80 to 100 people. And it was really, really strongly received and gave me a real spur that there must be something here that needs to be said. Now, interestingly, just a few days later was the East Japan earthquake and the consequent Fukushima nuclear accident. And so that obviously gave me a huge challenge right at the very beginning about what it is I just opened my mouth and said. So that's just an interesting factoid that's coming up to 10 years now. So I spent several years really blogging, actually, ran a fairly successful blog called Decarbonise SA, where I tried to popularise some of these ideas, particularly in the Australian context, but found myself as much or more getting a degree of global following out of that. And then fast forward further, and I was nearing the completion of a PhD, and there were some political events here in South Australia in particular. And my friend, who is now the general manager of Bright New World, was really pressing me to say, we need an organisation. You need an organisation because we've got to have more say in what's going on. And so that sort of really spurred the creation of a new environmental NGO, Bright New World. And it is proudly eco-modernist framed organisation that really wants to promote a really optimistic vision of the future based on science and technology, humans coming together, the removal of prejudices, and coming together for solutions. And as I like to say, we are wholly eyes open about the nature of the problems, but we have a conviction that the best way forward is to keep an assiduous focus on the good news, on the solutions, and on what we can do. And so Bright New World's coming up on about 3, maybe even 4 years old now. And I'm very proud of that. So even to survive in the space for a few years is a win, and we're looking forward to some
And you
strong
run
years
this
coming up. So
as a part-time gig too, like along with your regular job, right?
Yeah, look, I'm very pleased to say that the general manager is Dane Eckerman, and he does a lot of the operations, and I serve as chairperson and founder. And yes, it is an extracurricular for me that I do because it is the contribution that I can make that's very important. I work full time in a systems engineering and technology company, so that is my day job. Where there is some measure of alignment and crossover, is we do a lot of work in energy, but Bright New World is something that happens out of hours, but it's a really important part of my life.
Cool.
Great. So would you say Bright New World is focused on advocating nuclear power?
Yeah, it is. But I really like what we've got in our constitution, which is an extremely well-formed set of objectives. And the objectives are framed as the ends that we want to achieve, which is a stable climate, a world where humans can all achieve a measure of prosperity, where nature is returning and flourishing, where we are having a lighter impact on the planet. So it is very much focused on the outcomes we're seeking. The fact is, we understand nuclear technologies to have such a central role in achieving all of those outcomes. And as an NGO that is small, and so we need to be pretty targeted in what we commit our efforts to. And as an NGO that is based in a country where nuclear technologies are outright prohibited, it's really sensible and straightforward that that's our area of focus at the moment, because that is where we can have the most difference. If we were one more voice in some of those other issues presently, we might not move the needle all that much. So at present, by focusing on nuclear technologies, we find that we do make a difference.
Yeah, I was about to say, you kind of have a tall order to promote nuclear power where it's constitutionally banned. Can you give us maybe the history of that and what the effects have been of such a ban?
Yeah, for sure. So the history of it is interesting. It goes back to, I think it was 1998 or 1999. And it actually is tied to the processes that were necessary and important for Australia to invest in a new research and medical production reactor, which we now have, which is the Opal reactor in Lucas Heights in Sydney, at the Adelaide campus, which was commissioned in about 2005. So if you move back before that, we had an older reactor which needed to be decommissioned, and so there was the need to tender for and build a new research reactor. Now that also brought in a redevelopment of Australia's regulatory settings around nuclear technologies. And in that process, the opponents of nuclear power, I'll just use a shortcut, were keen to point out that the regulatory act that was going to govern the research reactor was not, by proxy, giving regulatory powers to also introduce a nuclear power production sector in Australia, if you follow me. And so that was fundamentally written into the RPANS Act, which is the regulatory act. It then got pretty much lifted up and put down again in our Environmental Biodiversity and Conservation Act, at a time where climate change was actually a pretty prevalent concern by 1998, 99, but still not quite as prevalent as today. Australia, the government at the time, which actually was a conservative government, clearly decided that the cost was not too high to have that put in. And it went in really quietly and really sort of easily. There wasn't much of a fight about it at all. And since then, we've had a default prohibition on nuclear technologies in Australia. So it happened with a whimper, not a bang. And that's actually quite concerning, and I hope everyone sort of pays attention to that. You have to look at what's going on in these processes because, to the second part of your question, Phil, the consequences of it are profound. once something is locked out of a jurisdiction, it's very difficult to come back from there. We are sort of trying to build a constitution, a constituency out of thin air in Australia. There is no incumbent sector. There are no stakeholders in Australia, communities, workers who are already benefiting from this. There's no one standing to lose if it goes backwards. We're just trying to create an understanding that there's a great amount to gain. And it's so difficult because it gets used as an excuse for nuclear to be left out of all analyses. So all of the analyses being done in Australia, it is either excluded because whichever institution just decides they can't be bothered and it's not worth it, or it's included, and as recently happened in a process called GenCost, it's included so badly with such a lack of rigour that we have just actually asked in this case, please exclude it. You have presented, in this case, SMR nuclear so poorly as to set it back in the Australian conversation. So it is an enormous struggle. And the only, one of the bright points on this is that, sadly, the Australian energy environment is becoming more and more dysfunctional over time, and pressure is mounting. So I feel there is a certain inevitability about these things changing, but it has been very, very costly, very, very costly.
For sure. And the electric grids in parts of Australia are very coal intensive. So this is a consequence of maybe potentially science denial or science illiteracy in a government policy that has very intense consequences.
It has profound consequences. And when we say coal dependent, it is among the most coal dependent grids in the entire world. Poland would be perhaps one of the only comparable grids, and perhaps a couple of locations in the United States. And so in terms of a country that is potentially exposed now to accelerating action on climate change, we've left ourselves in an unwise position. So if you go back to the 1998, 1999, you had a Conservative government that certainly was much less inclined to believe that taking climate change action seriously was a strong imperative, aided and abetted by an anti-nuclear faction that always puts anti-nuclear first and climate change second. So it was actually those two forces coming together with a left of centre Labor Party that also had a bit of an anti-nuclear bent and didn't yet care very much. And all of a sudden that was locked out. So the position it's left us is that we've got probably 15 to 20,000 megawatts of coal that are probably going to need to be retired from our major grid in the next 15 to 20 years. And those retirements might be brought forward. And despite the fact that we've got more than enough coal, there's no shortage of the stuff here in Australia. It is virtually implausible that any bank is going to finance a new coal-fired power station in a developed country like Australia from this point forward. And that leaves Australia with a really, really big transition challenge in the next 15 to 20 years.
So it sounds like you have a technical demand for an alternative to coal for the grid, and also this tall legal order with the barriers you just mentioned. So how would you summarize sort of like a hopeful future pathway of legalizing nuclear energy and incorporating it into the Australian power grid?
Yeah, great question, Colby. I think that I've always viewed these matters as you need to sort of hit the right equilibrium state of pain and opportunity, to be honest. That doesn't necessarily sound as optimistic as you might be looking for, but bear with me. We are going through a real struggle here in Australia as we try to work through what the solutions to that are going to be. There is a strong, at the moment, quite dominant narrative that there can be a solution to that based on variable renewable energy plus a profound expansion in the transmission network across Australia. I think that's currently starting to become a bit of a logjam and is going to experience real difficulties in implementation from here. So what I'm saying is I think that the difficulty we're going to experience is going to keep creeping up. what we really need, and what I do think is going to happen next, is that the barriers to entry for a fit-for-purpose nuclear solution are going to start coming down. So I see that over the next 5 years, we are going to be seeing more really demonstrable progress with some very important technologies, particularly in the form of small modular reactors, that are going to be very, very difficult for the Australian context to ignore. So where we see things that are 300 megawatts and less will connect really nicely in the Australian grid, which would actually struggle to put on 1,000 megawatt, 1,200, 1,600 megawatt units. It's not really built for that. But as we see those smaller reactors reaching commercial maturity and then deployment, they are such a neat fit that I think we will get to a position where those who have the ability to make these decisions will see that there is a technology development pathway that can happen pretty quickly following through the political change. And therefore spending that political capital will be worth it, because there will be action that will help come to those solutions. So I'm really saying we need to get the right solutions on the table, solutions that people in Australia can really see and believe in and get on board with. That's going to have to combine with probably just a bit more discomfort in the political and industrial sphere here in Australia, that we don't have the solutions. And then I feel that change actually can and will happen pretty swiftly. Because to remind you, we are already a nuclear country. We mine and export uranium. We have an excellent world-class research and medical isotopes production reactor. We have a nuclear science and technology organisation. We have a regulator, and we have a non-proliferation and safeguards office, which is extremely well regarded. So we have plenty of underlying infrastructure to do this. So I think that in the course of the next few years, we're going to reach a tipping point, and then we will move pretty affirmatively, pretty quickly, I feel.
It would be an interesting, case study in how a country that hasn't adopted nuclear power could adopt it in a 21st century way,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's really, really exciting. And when I get the opportunity, I like to ask Australian stakeholders to think in those terms. We have, for all of the crisis that we seem to be heading into, we have an advantage here, which is something of a blank slate in terms of how we want to do nuclear power. And that's a terrific question to be able to ask, actually. In 2021, it's quite good to be able to ask that question. If you hadn't done nuclear power yet, if you didn't have any of the legacy concerns from the 40s, 50s, and 60s about the nuclear power industry, what would you do? How would you design it in terms of regulation? How would you design it in terms of licensing, siting, design, waste management and technology? How would you develop it in terms of community engagement? This is actually really, really exciting, and I think Australia could do that really well. If it took it with both hands. It's the sort of thing Australia could surprise people on and do very, very well. And I think that would be brilliant. We would potentially, I would love to see us become a part of the research and development and commercialization effort for some of these newest technologies as part of our road forward. I think that would be very, very exciting. So yeah, watch that space. Let's see what happens. Because I do think that while I am absolutely supportive of large nuclear technologies, and they should be permitted here in Australia, I do think it's a fair call to say, if you were to use the expression fit for purpose, that 1,000 megawatt plus nuclear reactors are less fit for purpose than the small modular reactors in the pipeline. So I think from a pragmatic project management engineering perspective, that's likely the direction we're going to take. And so the ability to focus that on that direction, I think is a really exciting one.
Yeah, I agree. It's sometimes a very large facility is a good thing, but fit for purpose is a pretty good way to describe the role of SMRs and how they can kind of lead the way in getting established on the Australian grid.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, economically, we're looking at a country with very slow to sort of negligible growth in demand for electricity, for example. So that driver's not there. And we're reasonably confident that even with population growth, that's likely to continue for a range of technology reasons. So it might stay around about where it is presently. And then when you look at Australia, we've got about 25 million people. A lot of them are connected to the same electricity grid, the national electricity market of the eastern states, South Australia and Tasmania. And that grid is incredibly stretched in terms of its geography. So it's one of the longest and thinnest grids in the entire world.
Yeah, I mean, Australia has roughly the same land area as the continental United States, yet 1/10 of the population, roughly, you know.
That's right. So what you end up with, we don't have a sort of meshed, crisscrossed grid in the manner of the European Union or many sections of the United States. It's really a long and skinny grid. And on that entire grid, at present, the largest single generating unit is 750 megawatts. There is nothing larger than that connected to the Australian grid. Almost all of the generating units are 300 megawatts and less. They come together in some large nodes of power. So, some of the power stations themselves are 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 megawatts, but they're broken up into very small units. And part of the reason for that is you've got to manage your electrical grid to be able to lose its largest single unit and recover from it. And when you have a longer, skinnier grid that is less meshed, that unit size needs to be smaller. And so, we could do work to reinforce our grid and make it more able to accommodate those large sizes, for sure. That's where I come back to that expression, fit for purpose. It is just such a neat fit if we're able to have nuclear reactors that are at that smaller size. They will go on with no problem at all.
Right. So your grid is definitely quite a bit different from ours. And in our country, it's not illegal, but honestly, it's regulated near death. And it seems like its carbon-free electricity is not valued. What advice do you think you could give us from your effort in Australia to save nuclear energy in the United States? Because we're seeing plants closing right and left.
Yeah, I'm glad you've raised it, and I think what you've said in the question there at least shows me that there has been some change in that people are saying our carbon-free electricity isn't valued. Now, one of the last times I was in the United States, around about 2015, I think I spoke at, I think it was the largest sort of American nuclear industry conference or so. And we were asked some questions about this, and I sort of asked people to imagine, what would we think if nuclear power were invented today? If we'd never invented it before, what would we think of it? And in effect, the world got nuclear power a little before we kind of needed it. And so it's slipped through there unvalued. And I'm pleased to see that there has been a push, the most common sense imaginable policy push to say, if we are making clean energy, it needs to be valued in the market appropriately. Yeah, that's absolutely straightforward. As far as making that save in the United States goes, you've got to realise that every win or loss matters. There's no standing still in this situation as far as I'm concerned. If you're not moving forward, you're probably moving backwards. And so you've really got to go after each and every issue that is on the table and stand up for it, because there are forces that are going to want to push it back. And I would really caution the American nuclear community strongly against any idea that because it is so reliable, because it does so much of the work already, because there are so many people employed, that ultimately it's too important to fail and it will be okay. I really urge you to appreciate that that's not true. We have got policy examples from all over the world, not just Australia, where poor policy is formed that does a country real damage. And there are stakeholders in the United States who will not hesitate to push you in the direction of that policy and will not hesitate to see all of that pain inflicted on the American energy sector. So nuclear is not immune to that in the United States. It has to be standing up and making its case all the time. And that is changing a bit, but again, not as quickly as I would like. And, again, I would go back to this conference in 2015 and watching a very senior member of that conference address the entire conference and talk about headwinds, that the industry in America was facing some headwinds. And I was really shocked, a little bit appalled. And I was thinking to myself, no, these aren't headwinds. Your industry is on fire. You are going to be incurring huge losses in the next few years, and you're kind of downplaying it to your own people. So take it really, really seriously, is the advice I've got. Stand up for the industry and what it does, and make sure people know that you're there at all times, because you can be shut down. Just no doubt about that. You can be shut down.
And I think the industry in the United States has always been just too quiet. And I think, like you say, just constantly make your voice heard. I honestly think our nuclear industry needs to be a little bit more on the offensive instead of the defensive.
I agree. I've just I've been on Twitter this morning a little bit pissy, to be honest, at a new article that's been published in Nature, which is taking a little bit of a lecturing tone to the global industry about doing things right. And I think that while there are a couple of good messages in that article, it's taking the paradigm back way too far to putting the nuclear industry back on a thoroughly apologetic footing. And that, for me, is not the answer. There are times, absolutely, to be humble. You need to do your consultation appropriately. You need to communicate professionally. But apologising for existing is not the way forward. And you can't slip under the radar on this issue. You've got to be out and proud about what the industry is and what it does, and making the case at all times.
Yeah, there seemed to have been this philosophy where if you just, do the job and stay quiet, hopefully the anti-nukes won't notice you and they'll leave you alone. But that has not turned out to be an effective strategy. And I remember when I first got involved with nuclear advocacy back in around, I'd say 2015, there was a shareable image that said, for the United States, anti-nuclear hit list. And it was like about 10 nuclear plants on this list. And over the years, just one by one, they've been getting crossed out. And, it's really scary because we are losing plants. And that's a horrible and results in very harmful consequences for the grid, for the future, for the people whose livelihoods depended on those plants. So I agree. We really do need to be louder about this.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps the only positive to come out of those losses in recent years is the accumulation of evidence of what the results of that is. That is the perverse positive that's come out of that, is there is a lot more to point at. And you can see the way that has actually helped fold a number of other stakeholders into the call for, hang on, we cannot surely be doing this. That's actually brought a lot more people into that argument, and that's a really, really positive thing. But do not underestimate it. I mean, from the other angle, in Australia, the anti-nuclear forces have had the playing field all of themselves for a very, very long time, and that is one reason the Bright New World, which has stood on the shoulders of many other stakeholders, by the way, has been able to make such a difference, is because suddenly we've injected really serious competition into that conversation, and we've injected really serious competition into the consultation processes, and they're not used to that, and they're not used to having that space so heavily contested. But yeah, you got to be open-eyed about what's going on here. I am saddened to say, deeply saddened to say, that we see again and again so many organisations purporting to be concerned about the environment put anti-nuclear first and everything else a very, very distant second. And that is sadly the truth. Recent comments from the Union of Concerned Scientists about the closure of Diablo Canyon just really drove that home. That is the nature of the opposition, and you've got to get good at it. You got to take that contest out to where it's being fought. You can't fight it from behind your desk.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned how there's such a dominance of the anti-nuclear narrative in Australia, considering that Australia is one of the richest deposits of uranium in the world. I think Australia is something like 1/3 of the world's uranium supply.
Yes, that's correct.
And so you have quite a coal-dominated grid, and I guess one transitional thing that Australia could do is not only transition its own grid to uranium, but maybe like become sort of a uranium basket for the rest of the world if there is going to be this global energy transition towards nuclear. Do you think that would be a workable solution for a future thriving economy?
Well, I think it's a partial one. The nature of the situation here is that we've had the luxury of such plentiful energy in Australia for a really long time, of all sorts. Means that it's been pretty easy to have an anti-nuclear culture because we've never actually needed nuclear power. So that's very, very simple. We can be coal dependent and anti-nuclear all at the same time, and no one gets too upset, right? Easy.
Right.
Moving forward, what happens next? Yeah, that's a really, really different question. And the hypocrisy that you're alluding to is prominent, right? So we're the third largest exporter of uranium. We have the world's largest deposits, and yet we tell ourselves that this technology isn't to be used. That obviously can't stand forever. Our coal exports are enormous in energy, and they're going to some really, really some parts of the world that really, really need the energy and don't necessarily have substitutes yet, but some that do, including Japan and Taiwan. Well, what does the Australian anti-nuclear set have to say about that? The fact is, one of the quickest pathways out of that would be to grow nuclear power in other parts of the world. So we absolutely can be a bigger supplier of uranium to the world's global market. It's I guess one of the quirks, as you guys would know, a pellet of uranium fuel is worth about a metric ton of coal in energetic terms. And so as it happens, uranium fuel is really good value as a mineral export in terms of the energy you're getting. So we're not going to earn as much from exporting uranium as we currently earn from coal, simply because uranium is just such a vastly better fuel. It's just a vastly better fuel, right? There is a line, at any one time, there is a line of boats off the east coast of Australia near Newcastle waiting to load with coal and go to Asia. You fly into Newcastle and you'll see them lined up there waiting to pick up Australian black coal and take it out of the country. So we're not going to replace that in dollar value terms with uranium, but we could certainly replace it in energy terms with uranium and feel really, really good about the positive thing that we're doing for climate change in doing that. That would be a transition to be very proud of. Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. You see in the news, people are talking about, how there's so much renewable energy and climate progress in Australia when they're the largest exporter of coal in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And it's almost like if the country could be serious about climate change, like what a better fuel to export. But I know it wouldn't make as much money.
No, that's right. I mean, coal and natural gas. Our LNG exports are huge as well. I mean, we're the dealer, right? we are the dealer when it comes to climate change. It's Australia very much. We've got a case to answer here. So how do we transition ourselves? And also, what is our future in a world that transitions? This is a hard question that we're not properly asking yet. Better uranium export is definitely one answer. Another actually really plausible answer is that we become a host for used nuclear fuel at its end of life. So, I absolutely, from a technology perspective, would love to see the entire world run on its own fleet of integral fast reactors and advanced reactor technology, and everyone running nice little closed loop circles. Fine. But that is going to take a little while, right?
Yeah.
Between now and then, the world needs a whole lot more nuclear that's going to be running on once through fuel cycles. And there is the challenge of what to do with used nuclear fuel. Now, we know how to do that technically, and in engineering terms, that is not a problem. But socio-politically, that has been a very, very difficult thing to achieve. And if we look at, in particular, say, the Asia-Pacific and what we might hope that nuclear can achieve in penetration so as to deal with climate change, then we're talking about a lot of nuclear power plants in a lot of different countries in a region. And it does not seem like wisdom to expect every one of those countries to implement its own relatively small deep geological repository or some sort of above-ground storage facility for that material, particularly given that many of those countries are geologically far less suited to doing that. Then you have Australia. We're sitting there in the heart of that region. We are the most geologically suitable place to potentially do that. we will have been the source of the raw material, and we're an extremely politically stable and scientifically advanced country. If we were able to position ourselves as a country that either has a leasing arrangement for the uranium that we have mined, such that we track it and we take it back in its final form, or simply some other subscription service for holding used nuclear fuel, either for ultimate disposal or for future recycling, I would consider that our choice. That would be an incredibly valuable service into that Asian market, and Australia would profit from that hugely, and that actually would be large enough to substitute for a great deal of our fossil fuel exports. And essentially, we'd be taking care of closing that loop and becoming not only the exporter of the clean energy, but maybe the chief recycler in the world. So I see that Australia could have a phenomenally positive role in transitioning the world beyond fossil fuels. Our renewable resources can be a part of that. Yeah, I do agree, but it is really difficult to compete with that pellet of uranium that's worth a metric ton of coal. There's a lot more potential in there, and I think we've got to get after it.
Right. And I was going to kind of expand on the idea that I just hear it in the news all the time in renewable energy circles, is South Australia is like considered a poster child for renewable energy, and you always hear about this giant Tesla lithium-ion battery. However, the energy prices in Australia are some of the highest in the developed world. Do you think that renewables will just make that even more expensive?
So this is complex. So you're just going to have to bear with me, and the listeners are just going to have to bear with me while I break some of this down, Phil. There are reasons to look at South Australia's renewable energy transition and give it some props. So it started in about 2003, which is when the first wind turbine was built, and then in the last calendar year, we would have had about 50% of our power demand would have been from renewable energy sources. That's worth saying, okay, well, someone has done something right there. There's some more context needed, though. In that national electricity market that I spoke of earlier, South Australia is one of the very smaller regions. So we're only about 1.6 million people or so. Okay? So we're connected to Victoria, the neighbouring state, where the capital city, Melbourne itself, is about 4 million people. And the rest of Victoria is much more heavily populated. And then to the north of Victoria, New South Wales, which is the most populous state. Sydney, over 4 million people, and other quite large towns. So in the context of that interconnected grid, South Australia is one of the very smaller regions. By going first, South Australia really capitalised on the existing reliability and margins that were in the national electricity market. So we were able to, for the listeners who don't know, I live in South Australia, we were able to effectively use the rest of the national electricity market as our big battery. So we export and import power just about as required. And we have been able to lean on the reliability margins of the rest of the market. So we had a real first mover advantage, and we took it. So the trick in Australia is that it is going to be phenomenally more difficult, A, for South Australia to go from 50 to any further, 75, 80, 100%. But more importantly, B, for the likes of New South Wales and Victoria to even get to 20, 30, 40, 50%. Because all of that wind and solar is correlated in South Australia, particularly South Australia and Victoria, but also right up to New South Wales. The transmission grid between those states is now pretty much at its limit. It is getting harder and harder to connect new renewable energy projects. As a result of that, the new renewable energy projects are finding it harder to get to financial close. So this comes to something that I've been trying to, an understanding I've been trying to grow over a few years, which is that this is a non-linear process. It doesn't just improve in a straight line and we keep going to the end point. It gets harder on a curve as we go forward. And that's what we're starting to experience now in Australia. We've made it this far, but now it's getting awfully hard. Now, the prices have come down a little. The wholesale prices have come down a little, and the cheap renewable energy has been a partial driver of that. However, the concerns in system security have been high, kind of at crisis point, and are still very, very high. And our ability to keep connecting and adding more is now seriously constrained. And so we're hitting a point here where maybe we'll break through it and we'll accelerate through it again. I have a feeling we're gonna go through much more of a grind now to get that done. And there's no model out there for doing it. That's the other thing. I mean, we can't look at anywhere in the world that says, oh yeah, you can do this, you can succeed. Look at over here who did it. No, we don't know that yet. So no matter how I loop this around, it all comes back to a level of effort required that is no easier, possibly much, much harder than the level of effort that will be required to set up a right-sized, common sense, fit-for-purpose nuclear power sector to help us get the job done. There is no easy way to transitioning a country like Australia off fossil fuels. It's going to be hard. It's going to take 20, 30, 40 years, and we should be using all of the technologies available to get it done.
Yeah, the fact that there is that import-export margin from South Australia to the larger grid that has dispatchable fossil source energy, like that shows that there's actually a limitation of scaling at play. And you mentioned how you can't really get the intermittent renewable share past a certain percentage. The curve gets harder. I refer to that as grid saturation, meaning, at the point where a sunny and windy day is providing more energy than you need, once you get a grid to that point, there's still going to be a very large share of the annual energy use that's still going to be coming from firm sources that are dispatchable, and more times than not, that's a fossil fuel source. So
they're absolutely, and when you start eating out those sections of the market, naturally you're impacting the profitability of every other generator that needs to stick around.
Yeah.
Now that's okay for a period of time, but eventually it gets to the point where they leave. And so we've incurred a couple of those shocks now in Australia, where a couple of those coal-fired power stations have now shut down. And, that's, again, it's not a nice, gentle, straight line curve. All of a sudden, 1,000 megawatts departs. That's happened a couple of times. It's slated to happen a couple more times in a few years, and that's creating real concern. Because we look at the state of the grid now, and we look at then these big drop-offs that might come up and go, okay, that's really going to be uncomfortable. And as you say, you can keep adding wind and solar, but you'll be adding correlated supply. You'll be adding to that saturation.
Right.
We'll start experiencing more and more negative prices, which is absolutely happening in the Australian market more and more. Negative prices and oversupply. The next step apparently is to start adding lots and lots of grid storage. Well, again, I find that a little difficult to get on board with in that paradigm, because you're needing to build enough storage just to accommodate those intermittent periods of massive oversupply. Whereas storage in its own right can be a really useful optimizing device. If you have lots of different energy sources that are low marginal cost and low environmental impact, then you can use storage in a smart way. But this road we're on at the moment, Colby, it seems like keep breaking it and then do the next fix, and then break it again and find the next fix. And I'm not sure that's going to keep serving us too much longer. It's this incremental break and repair seems like a really low probability of success to me.
Yeah, and one thing I do is I model grids and look at roadmaps and see what's needed. And with one example I get hit with a lot is the Horndale Power Reserve, and people love sharing those articles with the headlines saying, hey, this new Tesla battery in Australia is saving customers millions already. And they think, oh, well, that means that batteries make money, therefore we can build more of them and they'll make just as much money or save just as much money. But they don't realize that's for ancillary services and frequency regulations. And there's, some is, load shifting. They'll get some revenue from using some of that for load shifting, but that's not going to get you out of 2 weeks of low wind and sun. And a lot of times solar and wind follows intermittency that's seasonal. So you get a few months.
Oh, it absolutely does. So yeah, let's set the record straight here. So let's start with the positive. So the Hornsdale Power Reserve in South Australia has been an excellent provider of frequency control ancillary services. So
Yeah, much better than
and
a gas plant.
absolutely. So we should all now be looking at large batteries and understanding that there's an assistive device there for providing frequency control, which is really terrific.
Yeah.
That's great. Let's use all the technology at our disposal. Let's remember a couple of other things though. There was never a problem with frequency control ancillary services. Okay, that wasn't a problem. I mean, just because the battery can respond virtually instantaneously and it was taking other providers some tenths of a second, which looks in comparison slow but is not slow, let's remember that was not a problem. It only became a problem when the frequency control ancillary services started departing the market along with those thermal generators because we'd never been valuing what they had been doing in the first place. A bit
Stable
like
dynamo.
yeah, exactly. A bit like clean energy from nuclear power. It was there all along, and no one noticed it until it left. So, one reason that the Hornsdale Power Reserve has been A, economically successful for itself, and then B, has improved, relatively speaking, the situation for Australian consumers, is that the prices of frequency control and ancillary services were going up and up and up. So that's what I mean by the constant sort of break and repair cycle. And then the whole model of using storage to overcome the variability of wind and solar is an arbitrage model, right? It's based on a broken market where you've got wildly swinging prices between super negative, where you're getting paid to charge, and super high, where prices are $5, $6, $10, $15,000 a megawatt hour in certain market closing intervals. So yeah, let's use all the technologies at our disposal. Is there a role for batteries on the grid? Yeah, absolutely there is. And in fact, in some places, we might be better placed to put in a large battery than we would be to expand a transmission line. Yeah, it could be a really good solution that should be looked at in terms of, is this a potential substitute for transmission? Or is it a complement for transmission? How can these technologies work together to give us the result that we need? But is the advent of these large grid-connected batteries the proof that a variable renewable energy-driven supply for a developed nation is now feasible, affordable, workable, proven and demonstrated? No, it absolutely is not. And the Hornsdale Power Reserve is not doing that in Australia. It does not provide volume electricity in that way at all. That's just not what it does.
Yeah, and speaking of big batteries on the Australian grid, there's another mega project underway right now called Snowy 2.0. And for our listeners not familiar with this, it's basically this massive pumped hydro project that's stated to have 350 gigawatt hour storage capacity with a 2 gigawatt power capacity. And it's absolutely massive. It's bigger than anything that's ever been done in the world as far as pumped hydro is concerned. And I've always been curious, I'm not from Australia, but I'm looking at the numbers of this thing and, do locals know about this? Is there opposition to it? Is there support? So what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, look, it's funny you should say that. So the Snowy project, Australians, we're a funny bunch, mate. So we know we're a bit little and we're down the other end of the world, from where, the English-speaking people came from, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a bit of an inferiority complex from time to time. So we like to tell ourselves interesting stories about ourselves. One of our big stories about ourselves is the Snowy Hydro project. So back in the 1950s or 60s, I can't remember, but it was a massive post-war engineering infrastructure project in Australia to build hydroelectric system in the Snowy Mountains of New South Wales. And all mockery aside, it's the existing Snowy Hydro facility is an impressive engineering feat that exists in Australia. Where we have made lakes, we have made tunnels, and we do hydro. That's all relatively constrained in Australia because Australia being such an geologically old piece of the earth means it's also very flat and it's also very dry. So there are some limits to what we're ever going to be able to do with hydroelectricity. But now we're looking to do Snowy 2.0, which is, as you've described, a major upgrade to the pumped hydro facilities in Australia. And what do we think about it? Do we know about it? Yes, everyone knows about it. What's the feeling about it? Wow. Really mixed sentiment. And for me, reading a lot of the commentary, which I've largely stayed out of, it seems like a real episode of cognitive dissonance happening in the sort of Australian energy commentariat. So, it's renewable energy, right? So this is meant to be what the future, and in all of the plans, studies around the world, they all include hydro and they all include pumped hydro, and so you would think, okay, renewable energy, gigantic pumped hydro, how can anyone not be in favour of that? Well, there are some ways, it turns out. When you read a lot of the commentary, what you find and you notice is that a lot of people seem to be very upset because it is effectively reinforcing a very large centralised model of power generation. So you've described the scale there, Colby, right? It's big, right?
Yeah.
So if the paradigm you've been working from is that this is actually about sort of smash the system, the end of centralised power generation, the end of large power generation, we're going to distribute, we're going to democratise, we're going to break this down and break this apart, and look at how terrific wind and solar is for that. And then suddenly you see something of that scale happening. It doesn't actually fit the paradigm all that well. And so I'm seeing a big bit of dissonance there. And part of that dissonance is that if you were to build that in New South Wales, economically speaking, and in terms of the function of the market, it would, for a period of time in front of it, it would probably reinforce the role of the existing black coal generation in New South Wales and Queensland, which is geographically nearby. It's a low marginal cost producer. And coal-fired power electricity pushes water up a hill just as nicely as wind and solar-powered electricity.
Arguably more reliably too.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a point I was making earlier about building storage capacity. If you've built X gigawatt of capacity, you'd like to use that for as many hours as possible. You don't just want to use it occasionally. So, if we're having a free market here, that means that facility is going to be just as accessible to the coal-fired generators, and it might reinforce their business case in Australia for several years. Well, imagine trying to reconcile that in your head if you think you're pro-renewables. And then it also sort of leads to the suggestion from a lot of people that no, when we said pumped hydro, what we meant was distributed pumped hydro. So we see a network of pumped hydro all over the country of little, smaller, distributed pumped hydro right next door to the wind and solar facilities. Now, I said before, I work at a systems engineering and technology company during the week, and there is nothing easy about delivering hundreds of fundamentally bespoke civil engineering projects. Every one of them is going to be hard in their own way, and getting hundreds of them done is going to be even harder. And every one of them will have their own challenges with the bank to get finance. And when we look across the Australian scene at how's that going with the distributed pumped hydro, it's going really, really slowly. And the first few sites that people are trying to exploit are sites that already have partial infrastructure in place. An old gold mine that already has an upper and a lower lake, in a sunny part of Queensland. It's a dream, as far as a distributed pumped hydro storage site. It's fantastic, right? Has it made financial close? No, not yet. So this is all very conflicted in the Australian energy conversation right now, and I feel comfortable sitting where I sit because I see storage as it's just a tool. It's just a tool to optimize the grid that you're building around it. And if you took that black coal out of New South Wales and you replaced it with nuclear power, as well as continuing to build out the wind and solar power, well, they could all utilise whatever storage is available on the grid in an optimised fashion. The storage would be running at high utilisation, so we'd be getting the best return on the capital that we spent on building the storage. All the generators would be low marginal environmental cost and low marginal financial cost. That surely is the goal. So Yeah, will Snowy 2.0 get built? Yes, I think it probably will. It's going to be a big effort, though, because it is a very, very big project.
Yeah, I know it involves a 27-kilometer underground conduit and covers a lot of land. And just for our listeners to know, 350 gigawatt hours, it sounds huge. It is huge for a pumped hydro station, but that still only equals about 12 hours average on the Australian grid. So it's
That's so, you know, you're not going to get weekly or seasonal results in terms
exactly.
of building that, and we would know that we need it. And at the risk of having virtually a cliched conversation presently, we can see what happened in Texas and the south of the United States in terms of, well, what is a worst case scenario in terms of a gap?
Indeed.
The worst case scenarios are pretty big.
Yeah, for sure. It would be a big project. And many renewable-only advocates point to that project, and there are many problematic reports from various universities and interest groups presenting themselves as roadmaps to 100% renewable energy, which eventually influence government policy and can cause drastically harmful consequences. Do you feel it is important for pro-nuclear NGOs to not only expose the bad methods of these reports, but also present nuclear-focused roadmaps that use the same methods in demonstrating feasibility?
Short answer, yes, absolutely, I do. And there's a lot of work in doing that. I mean, I come with my Bright New World hat on. I am envious of the endless pots of money that seem to be available to write these renewable energy only roadmaps. You guys may or may not know, and the audience may or may not know, some years ago I wrote a paper called Burden of Proof, which has gone on to be a fairly highly cited paper in the energy literature.
I cite that all the time, actually.
Oh, that's nice. Thanks, Colby. Where we tried to scoop up what was out there in the literature as these 100% renewable roadmaps and try to put them through a screening process for feasibility. And a big part of my motivation for doing that was that there was the body of literature was being presented as an existing body of literature that is internally consistent, that's all coming to the same conclusion that this is really doable. And that isn't the case. All of the papers had really serious problems and limitations in them. Some of them are almost comically so.
Yeah.
And it was also internally a very, very inconsistent body of literature. Some are using biomass. Some are saying biomass is unacceptable and unsustainable. Some are making enormous assumptions about hydroelectricity, where others are saying, no, we're going to need to use less hydroelectricity. Some of the assumptions on the transition that would happen first in the way we use energy in terms of
1/3 reductions.
Oh, absolutely. Heroic assumptions, both in the quantity, but also in the underlying systematic change that would be required to get that quantity.
Yeah.
So the dependencies written through them all are quite horrible. And so I was stunned to see this come up again just a few days ago with an Australian scientist called Andrew Blakers, who is the parent of this distributed pumped hydro model in Australia. Mark Jacobson, Brad Van Matheson, and several others putting this forward again in 2021. And I felt like, oh my God, have I just had a fever dream where the last 10 years didn't happen and they're just talking about this again? I was really amazed. And we do need to point out what's real and what's fake in the work that's being done there. We do need to bring forward something that's better. And the enormous advantage that you have of not being just 100% renewables is you've got more tools in your toolbox. You're going to come up with something that's more effective and more feasible and easier to optimize and far more believable. There's a certain, I don't know about you guys, but even if you're not sort of an energy modeler like Colby or someone who's got the background in it like I do, certain citizens actually get a bit of a fairly accurate idea of whether they're being sold something that's plausible or implausible. Do you get that sort of feeling? And, I've had that here in Australia, particularly with some of the unions that support the coal mining and the coal-fired power generation regions in Australia. And they get told that, oh, no, you've got a great jobs future under this paradigm. And they kind of look at it and go, I'm pretty sure we don't. I don't think this is actually deliverable, and I don't think there's any place for me and my people and my skills in this plan you're putting forward. And they're really open to and really wanting an alternative plan. So yeah, getting much more on the front foot of that is important. But wouldn't it be nice if this didn't need to be an industry-led push? It should just be the way it gets done. Institutes should be technologically neutral. Organizations should be technologically neutral. The IPCC, the IEA, they should all just be looking for the correct optimized solution here. It's actually, it becomes difficult when it looks like it's a deliberate effort to push back in a direction to include nuclear. People start to talk about that as pro-nuclear. It's actually really, really challenging. But unfortunately, if you go 100% renewables, you're treated with a beautiful green halo. So it's a very, very difficult space. But I'm more comfortable here than I was because this conversation has been had for over a decade now. There's been plan after plan after plan after plan, and they all come to very, very little. I mean, even in just 10 years in Australia, we've been through solar thermal with molten salt storage is going to run Australia. We've been through wind and solar are going to run Australia. We've been through wind and solar with distributed pumped hydro storage is going to run Australia. And now we're talking about solar power from the north of Australia through a cable is going to run Singapore.
Oh, I've heard of that one. Yeah. That one was amazing. Kind of faulty. What do you see? Yeah. Like, how do you feel when you see constant? Because I mean, yeah, sure, maybe in like the fossil fuel unions and stuff, they are skeptical of wind and solar and its efficacy. But what I see is a lot of activists believing the idea that nuclear is not only not needed, but it's actually detrimental to the climate. And I see people, especially like Jacobson at Stanford, constantly saying that it's just like useless. And I think there was a recent article in Nature with a lot of the renewable scientists, and I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
No, I know exactly. I know exactly what you're trying to say. I'm watching it too. I'll say something positive about that, Phil. I think that's on its way out. I really do. I don't think that there's much generational renewal in that position, to be perfectly honest. I think that if we really look across the arc of change on these issues, it's changing, and the momentum behind that change is building pretty strongly, where you can't really cling to such demonstrably false statements too much longer, or some people can, but they're not going to have a lot of currency in serious conversations for too much longer. I think at the moment what we're seeing is what I kind of call a dead cat bounce. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that expression, but it looks like the cat's alive. It's just bounced, and I think that's happening presently, and it might happen for a few more years. We might just see a little bit of an uptick of that now. But, gee, it's really having to start to work hard as more and more global institutions are coming around to a much more straightforward position on that. You see the seeds of a change in position in the United States Democratic Party, for example, in how it is sort of treating and approaching this. Heaven knows not as much as we might like to see, but it's there. As you see more and more nations including it in their strategies, as you see the nations that have made net zero carbon commitments, they've got nuclear centrally in those plans. I think that is now in its sort of last iteration.
And hopefully some of these environmental activist groups will start abandoning the nuclear is not needed trope too,
I don't know what their future is. I really don't know what their future is on that point. It is such a point of identity for these organizations. In starting an NGO, naturally I did a little bit of research about, well, where do NGOs come from and what are they all about? And most of the big names that we know today Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, World Wildlife Fund. They were all born around about the same time, about the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s. And you know what the big issue was at that point in time? Population growth.
Yeah, first chapter in their platform was about population. Second chapter was energy.
That's right. So these organizations were founded at the point where the prevailing environmental concern was that the rate of population growth was frighteningly high. What they didn't know at the time when they were forming them is that they were at the peak of it. So the rate of global population growth started declining at virtually the same time as these organizations were formed. So they were formed from a position of crisis and identity that is now really quite redundant. You know, we would all find the challenge easier with fewer people, but that particular issue is fundamentally solved. We don't know where the final number's going to land, but the trajectory is set. And the challenge now is to provide enough clean energy for people. Climate change wasn't even on the agenda when those organizations were formed. So how the major organizations overcome that conflict of identity in the next 10, 15, 20 years, I don't know. And I think what we're probably going to see is a swelling in the middle ground. I think we're going to see a growth in output and a growth in position for the medium-sized NGOs. They are not going to be the globally known brand names, but they're going to be organisations that actually make a significant contribution in their own jurisdiction. You know, I think of organisations like a Clean Air Task Force in the United States, for example. You know, it's not a globally recognised name, but gee, they do good work. You know, and they know what they're talking about on this subject. Whereas the majors on that topic, I think they're going to start to feel the pinch of irrelevance on that, and they're going to start to suffer from it.
I think young people are catching on to it too. It's an interesting generational, like you say, identity thing. So
yeah, it absolutely is, and it helps because like nuclear technologies, and particularly the SMRs that are being designed and some of the new companies that are designing them, they're really appealing. Like they're cool, you know.
Yeah,
they're beautiful. They're beautiful. They do amazing work. There'll be things that we can get up close to. They're going to be things that we can really embed in communities and towns and industries. They're clean and they make power all day long. And they're some of the best jobs going around in science and technology. Like there's a lot of appeal in that. So it's going to be a very difficult sell to try to tell a new generation of people that those technologies are wrong and shouldn't be, at the same time as telling them that climate change is the major crisis they've got to think about. I just think more and more young people are going to take a sniff of that and go, I don't think I want any, thanks very much.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree.
Well, hey, we've been talking for a while here, and I know your time is valuable.
But yeah, if people want to learn more about you, your work, and Bright New World, where should they go?
Well, if anyone would be encouraged by me to please visit brightnewworld.org. That is our home. You'll find some of our articles there where we're writing. You can join up and become a subscriber. We welcome every and any subscriber into our fold. We are taking new memberships and we're having an annual general meeting in the next couple of months. So if you'd like to join the community, there will be some invitations coming out soon for sitting in and hearing about our annual report, hearing from the board, and hearing about our directions coming up. So that is from brightnewworld.org. You'll find me on Twitter. I am at BNW_Ben, and I'm fairly active in that space. But, you know, we are based here in Australia, and this is where we're working, but we really strive to be part of a global effort in that NGO space.
Sorry, what was that Twitter handle again?
That is BNW, capital B and W for Bright New World, _Ben. That's how you'll find me on Twitter. So we strive to be part of an active global community in that pro-nuclear NGO space. So you'll see us interacting with, co-signing and working together with like-minded organisations around the world. We have a strong conviction that's how we get things done. We're a collaborative organisation, so we welcome members and supporters from all over the world. So come and find us at brightnewworld.org.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. This was an awesome discussion. We covered a lot of stuff.
That's been a real pleasure. They were really well-formed questions. It's nice to be able to get into a little bit of the nuance and detail about some of the things that are happening where I'm from that are really relevant to the challenges elsewhere in the world. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for the chat.
Thank you. It was a great chat.
All right. Well, we'll hopefully talk to you some other time.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, guys.
Well, that was a lot of fun. I was thrilled to talk to one of the superstars of nuclear advocacy, and I admire Ben and his work. He is just a wealth of knowledge and insight when it comes to sustainable energy systems.
For sure. Ben is also very skilled in communication. He is great at making a case for nuclear power and has the ability to connect with people by conveying a positive message with compelling research. Phil, what stood out the most to you about this conversation?
Yeah, what I appreciated the most was the advice he gave us on how to get nuclear power more politically and socially accepted here in the United States. Basically, we have to stop taking the continued existence of nuclear power for granted in this country and fight like hell to keep reactors running for climate reasons. Lots of us are needed to continually speak up for clean energy like nuclear and show people the incredible environmental and societal benefits of the technology. When it comes down to it, nuclear power is as valid as renewable energy, if not more effective. Its carbon-free energy benefits just need to be valued in society and the economy. It will take many dedicated pro-nuclear individuals to start the conversation to change public perception of nuclear power. This is not an easy path, and we need to put in the work and continually spread the word. How about you, Colby? What part of the discussion with Ben did you find most useful?
Well, I was happy to get into the unique characteristics of the Australian grid, because it can serve as a case example for how grids function. South Australia, which only represents a small fraction of the Australian grid, is often touted as an example of how renewables can scale. But in reality, that region is still fossil fuel dependent and shares a big import-export margin with neighboring fossil fuel-dominated grids. The storage arguments can also be put to the test, as the Hornsdale Power Reserve is only a success due to low penetration and the revenues from the ancillary services it provides, rather than scalable firming for wind and solar intermittency. Snowy 2.0 is a massive pumped hydro project that still won't be able to sufficiently provide firming for the Australian grid due to its limited power capacity of 2 gigawatts. I was excited to talk to Ben about grid modeling and energy policy because it overlaps so much with the work I do.
Definitely. Pretty much everything we hear from Ben and his organization Bright New World is awesome stuff. We wish everyone at Bright New World success with their efforts in Australia and around the world.
For sure. We appreciate our conversation with Dr. Ben Hurd. We want to thank him again for his valuable time to speak with us today. This has been Legalizing Nuclear Power. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you heard and want more content, you can support Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast on a per-episode basis with Patreon. Link in the description. To support Americans for Nuclear Energy and our general mission, visit our website at www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. We have a link to donate with PayPal under the Mobilize page. You can also purchase some Americans for Nuclear Energy swag under our store page. This will really help us pay for the little things, especially online service fees, to keep our organization running. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. Lastly, we really want your feedback. Let us know your thoughts, questions, and concerns. We have a message form on our website under the About section, or you could email us directly at main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast. We'll see you next time.
Edited and produced by Jonna Adams.